It's so good to see you all for week 7 of our seminar on the work of our sort of sprint through the work of Frantz Fanon. Week 7 means we're more than halfway through the semester, which is kind of crazy, but also very exciting. We're moving incredibly fast, far too fast to really be dealing with the seriousness that we need to. But I think we're getting some good things out of all the pieces and the way they work together as we move through it. I want to say quickly before we start that, just as a reminder, we're going to be premiering a interview that Sunny, carried out with the great Mumia Abu-Jamal directly after this seminar. So if you're on the feed, please stay on the feed. There'll be some sort of disruption, and then you'll begin to see the interview. And same for folks in the room that will be watching this, this essential interview with Mumia about questions that have everything to do with the work of Fanon. And Mumia is not only a great revolutionary and inspiration, but he's also a scholar of Fanon. He's writing a dissertation on Fanon, and is someone we can learn a great deal about when it comes to interpreting and applying the work of Fanon today. I want to say a few things about what we talked about last week before we dig into a dying colonialism this week. We talked a little bit about the historical context that Fanon found himself in a sort of transitional period where he had arrived in Algeria, between arriving in 1953 and his letter of resignation in 1956. We spoke about the way that the sort of historical context was one marked by what I refer to as the Algerian explosion, which began not only in 1954 with the outbreak on November 1st of the Algerian Revolution, but also earlier in the Sétif massacre of 1945, and the ways in which not only did both of these explosive moments parallel Fanon's analysis of his own understanding of kind of anadialectical rupture, the need for him to explode in order to make himself known, as he put it in Black Skin, White Masks, as a precondition for any possible dialectical motion. But we also saw the ways in which his letter of resignation then in 1956 marked another piece of continuity in that his concept of sociogeny, which he had first applied to psychiatric questions, right? The idea that psychological ailments can find their source in the social structure. This was the sort of inversion of that in the natural logical extension of it, right? The sociogenic imperative that says, if you cannot cure individuals when the society is sick, you need to set about curing that society, right? You need to turn your attention and your agency toward that structure in revolutionary ways. We saw how Fanon, in the aftermath of his resignation, is sort of relocated to Tunisia, he writes for the magazine El Mujahid. And we saw the ways in which these writings in the sort of then, late 1950s attested to what kind of imperfectly I described as a dialectic of simplification, a sort of process of polarization that unified the Algerian struggle on both sides, right? The unification of the Algerian people on the one hand and of the French settlers and France as a whole on the other. And we saw the ways that, of course, torture was an essential symptom of this, something that for Fanon was not an accident in colonialism, but essential to it, inextricable from it. We saw the ways that the French and European left more broadly would betray the anti-colonial struggle repeatedly, speaking again to the unification of the struggle in a certain sense against Europe. And we saw the way that Fanon worked through questions of truth and the true meaning of a sort of substantive independence when it came to this process of polarization in the Algerian struggle. Meaning, for example, what does truth mean? Truth means what it means for us, right? What is independence? It means substantial sovereignty, not just sort of neo-colonial continuity. Now, on the YouTube stream last week, there was a question or a comment from, and I just want to make sure I get this username right, official Rick Ross 8718, about Edwige Danticat's novel The Dew Breaker, which deals with the question of the long shadow of torture under the Duvalier regime in Haiti. And it's a great question. It's about how does this connect to Fanon's question of torture, both the victims and the perpetrators. And I may just be mentioning it because of the amazing username, but it's an interesting question that also brings us back to last semester's conversation about the Haitian Revolution. And essentially the story is about as I understand it, about a former torturer in the Duvalier regime in sort of the middle of the 20th century in Haiti, a dew breaker being, sort of the name for torturers. And what's interesting is that the key difference that you might want to identify then, with regard to Fanon's analysis of torture, is that, of course, if you're talking about Duvalier in Haiti, you're talking about a neo-colonial regime, right? Installed in the aftermath of the long US occupation. But at the same time, historically, it's happening almost at the same time as Fanon's own analysis. Papa Doc Duvalier is installed in 1957, exactly the time when Fanon is writing these works and the year that he arrives in Tunis. The question, however, and this is really important, of neocolonialism is not one of an exact replica. And I think that's what's so crucial about it, right? And this is where the novelty is important, but also the continuity. And it's very relevant in that sense for us in this era, which is very much marked by representation politics, right? Because what is the difference? The difference is that in Duvalier's Haiti, these are Black Haitians torturing Black Haitians, right? And the warnings that Fanon had already begun to give us around neocolonialism, not only around negritude as a frame, but also around the paradoxical stages of decolonization, create a necessity to be very, very conscientious of the ways in which his work is going to point increasingly toward what just last week he referred to as a new concept of neocolonialism, right? A concept kind of coined by Sartre, popularized by Nkrumah, and which speaks to a threat that's just on the horizon as Fanon is writing, right? Interesting, again, last semester, we saw that C.L.R. James himself had dealt with the question of the Duvalier regime in an essay that very sort of suggestively was entitled Black Sans-Culottes, right? Not the Jacobins, but the grassroots level. We'll talk more about James today, but today we're moving into A Dying Colonialism, the second of Fanon's books to be originally published. Toward the African Revolution was actually published later, even though some of the writings were drawn from an earlier period. A Dying Colonialism is published in 1959, however, and so first we sort of need to catch up with our timeline and fast forward from Fanon's arrival in Tunisia in 1957 to the state of the revolution in 1959, right? This is the sort of 2 years we have to cover, and it's a fucking wild 2 years, let me just say, from the very beginning. So Fanon, when he originally leaves Algeria, he resigns, he's declared essentially persona non grata, expelled from the territory. He returns very briefly to Paris, but at this point he's essentially being actively sought by the police and has to be very careful with his sort of travel and with his sort of connections, and then arrives very quickly, maybe about a month later in January 1957 in Tunis. Fanon would never set foot in France again. He would never publish in its journals, and he would be sort of scornfully dismissive of most things French from here on out. Both a personality trait and, of course, we know, a politics. But to be clearer than maybe I was when folks raised this question last week, he did continue to do psychiatric work, right? There's this sort of question about his relationship to the profession, and to be super clear, his relationship to the French profession and the French structure of kind of colonial psychiatry was over at this point, both because he wanted it to be over and because he had essentially, again, been expelled from that. But he did continue to work as a psychiatrist and to publish psychiatric research in Tunisian and Moroccan journals. And remember that Tunisia had become independent just the year before, right? Less than a year before. He takes a position at a clinic, the Manouba Clinic. He also takes a position at a medical hospital, and he's doing a lot of really interesting work that I would love to talk more about, but actually I think we have way too much historical content to deal with. So if people are really interested in that, we can think, in some ways about the questions of what he is practicing in Tunisia, how it relates to what he had learned in St. Alban, what he had tried to apply to the context of Blida. Meanwhile, what is happening in Algeria itself? The answer is incredibly important, because the answer is the Battle of Algiers, right? Now, for those who have not seen the movie, those of you who have seen the movie, I'm going to assume that it's all of you, because I can't actually contemplate or tolerate the fact that there may be people who haven't seen the Battle of Algiers. If you haven't, watch it immediately. It's incredibly important, possibly the best movie ever made. And it's important to understand that this is a movie made by Pontecorvo just a couple of years after the revolution. It's actually an astonishing feat, right? To make an entire movie about the course of a revolution that has only just ended. And because of that, and because of the question is still incredibly sensitive in France, it's banned systematically in France, and with good reason. People may know some of the lore about the Battle of Algiers. We talk more about it maybe next week, but it includes things like being shown in screenings by the CIA in order to attempt to teach counterinsurgency through understanding the mistakes made in the Algerian context, right? Now, again, for those who have seen the movie, it has a slightly strange structure, a kind of strange temporal structure that you might have noticed, which actually reflects its peculiar location within the history of the revolution. Now, what do I mean by this? The bulk of the story of the movie, and specifically also of the Battle of Algiers itself, first and foremost, is a story of failure and defeat. But it's one that then, and here, sort of major spoiler alert, the movie ends with a sort of unexplained victory and the feeling also that this victory was somehow inevitable. For people that have seen the movie, you can kind of situate it, right? It ends in a certain way, and then there's just a couple of minutes afterward that are a testament to an inevitable victory. That is years later, right? This is a very effective structure on an emotional level, but it's also the product of this second question, which is the fact that the Battle of Algiers, which again was very much a defeat, and a relatively quick defeat at that, also occurred relatively early on in the war, and more specifically, it occurred during the course of 1957, right? Right after Fanon arrives in Tunisia, the Battle of Algiers is raging in the Algerian capital. While the Battle of Algiers was meant as the sort of final FLN incursion into Algerian cities that would expel the colonizer once and for all, the result was in many ways the opposite. Most FLN cadre in the urban areas were killed or imprisoned, with many combatants and sympathizers fleeing into the countryside. Moreover, by mid-1957, France had completed what was called the Ligne Maurice, a massive, it's up here, there's a picture of it up here on the top. It's a massive defensive line that runs the entirety of the Tunisian border and also down the Moroccan border as well, consisting of barbed wires, electrified fencing, and landmines. And it was literally built to prevent the infiltration of supplies and support troops coming from Tunisian and Moroccan territory, to prevent essentially what had been happening, which is there are armies massed in both of those countries that were feeding troops into the Algerian rebel forces. The finishing, sort of the defeat in the cities and the completion of these mass, defensive lines by the French left the wilaya, or the FLN military regions inside the country, isolated from the cities and isolated from any and all outside support. This was not a good moment for the Algerian Revolution, in other words, 1957. So how do we get from defeat in the Battle of Algiers and isolation to the confidence of an inevitable victory that we find both in the film and also in Fanon's writing on the subject during this period? While Fanon himself may be prone to dramatic and overconfident rhetoric, and while any revolution certainly needs to project confidence if it's ever going to succeed, we're also talking about real dynamics that are at the heart of Fanon's analysis throughout his work. To see this, we just think for a moment about how the Battle of Algiers itself played out. It begins with this sort of strategic turn toward an escalation of bombings in settler areas, right, in the European part of Algeria. And these are bombings that are targeting civilians. This creates, of course, total havoc. Troops were deployed, checkpoints were built. Of course, it doesn't stop the bombings and the attacks. And so as we see in the film, there's a cycle of escalation with the pieds noirs, the white settlers, becoming more openly racist, demanding greater repression. We see more vigilante bombings by these white settlers and attacks. And so we see in the film the way that this cycle escalates, with the pieds noirs becoming increasingly racist, increasingly aggressive, And we see ultimately that this leads to total military control being handed over to the paratroopers under, in the film, Lieutenant Colonel Mathieu, who is here, if people remember from the film, Lieutenant Colonel Mathieu, and who is a thinly veiled representation of Brigadier General Jacques Massu, who's actually the person historically who takes over control. Where there had been debates about torture in France, the military now turned to modes of torture that rarely yielded useful information, but which only guaranteed further resistance and polarization. In other words, what we're seeing is a process of heightened polarization, a sharper division between sides, and a process of mutual reaction and homogenization. That's a really important way to look at it. Europeans on one side, Algerians on the other. This division, moreover, takes the form of a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. The attacks on those settlers seen as and understood as civilians pushed the Pieds Noirs to be exactly what they had to be to play their role to perfection, meaning to be brutally racist toward Algerians, to treat them as inborn and unassailable enemies, and to thereby make clear to Algerians that France didn't care about them, as Fanon writes, and that their only option lay with the revolution, right? The drawing of lines with absolute and total sharpness. It sharpened the division of Algeria into us versus them, native versus colonizer, or in other words, Fanon's In the Wretched of the Earth, his later famous description of the colonial situation is fundamentally Manichaean, right? Absolutely divided into two opposing parts. Now, there were two key implications for Fanon's role specifically. First, it's after the Battle of Algiers and this defeat that El Mujahid, the newspaper magazine, is transferred to Tunisia, from where Fanon wrote the pieces that we read last week. A second key side effect of the defeat in Algiers was that it brought a newfound emphasis on diplomacy and the international audience. These would be where Fanon would begin to play his most important roles in the revolution. Military victory on the ground was unlikely. The revolution needed to internationalize by turning toward diplomatic pressure at the expense of the leaders on the ground. And the two kind of fit together. El Mujahid, the newspaper, wasn't really geared toward fighters on the ground. It was addressed toward international audience, toward the United Nations and other foreign supporters. Now, very interestingly, I was talking about this before we went on the stream. One of my favorite facts about the film, The Battle of Algiers, is the fact that Saadi Youssef in the top picture plays himself in the film in the bottom picture, right? This is actually a real-life picture of this FLN leader who then goes on to help advise the filmmakers and, then plays himself in the character of Jafar. So the revolution has to become international, and France helps with that internationalization by accident, or sort of, it depends on how you see it, because in 1958, France bombs Tunisia in retaliation for FLN attacks. The attack was, devastating in its own right. Of course, it led to a reaction in Tunisia, a reaction by North African countries to the French presence in the region. But it was even more important because it provoked a long simmering crisis at home within the French government. This is where shit gets incredibly interesting. Now, recall that Fanon had written about how Paris was being held prisoner by the Pieds Noirs of Algiers. And this is when it's becoming more than clear, since colonial policy in Algeria, meaning in the colony, created a crisis so powerful that it brought down the government in Paris, right? So there's a full-blown crisis, a constitutional crisis. The government in Paris collapses in April of 1958. And the question then was, who would replace the government and what would their policy be on Algeria? Would they seek a negotiated solution, or would they cave to the demands of the French settlers? And there's a point at which Fanon says, these are the only two options. You can either smash feudal power in Algeria or, cave to the demands of the settlers, and they're not allowing any other options. Now, here's another key figure. Remember this name because it will come up again, Raoul Salan. Salan was the general in charge of overall forces in Algeria. And amid the constitutional crisis in Paris, Salan told Paris that the Algerian settlers and the soldiers demanded a new leader who would let them win. And he said that he couldn't vouch for their actions if they didn't get that. Essentially, he's passing on a message, this was his way of passing on a message that Algeria would be ungovernable if they were not given everything that they wanted. Massou, the brigadier general, essentially below Salan, demanded that this new leader be none other than Charles de Gaulle, who, on the one hand, for people who know who Charles de Gaulle was, most famous sort of French leader perhaps of all time, on the one hand, the leader of the Free French Forces, right? The spearhead of the military resistance to the Nazis. In other words, the very same leader that Fanon himself, when he was young, had volunteered to fight on the side of, but who, on the other hand, was a far-right nationalist himself. This is why they wanted him back in power. They thought he would represent Algerian, the Algerian settlers' demands. This is a very, it may seem strange, very common phenomenon in France where the actual fascists were anti-Nazi because they were part of the resistance. Peculiar, but this is the French reality. So the governor in Algeria during this crisis, whose name is Lacoste, ironically, he's a socialist. He flees Algeria. He leaves a vacuum of power, and in this context, there are demonstrations by the settlers. Raoul Salan, the overall general, is booed. Massou, who's seen as more radical, he is cheered in the streets by these increasingly aggressive white settlers. And by the end of this crisis, both of these generals essentially seize power and declare a new emergency regime in Algeria. There's been essentially a coup in Algeria during a crisis of and an absence of a French government and the absence of the governor in Algeria. And they threatened even to attack Paris if de Gaulle was not instituted as the new leader. The colonial blackmail being posed by the Algerian settlers worked like a charm. De Gaulle formed a government in May 1958 and was granted special powers for reforming the constitution and establishing what came to be known as the Fifth Republic. But while these most fascistic representatives of the Pieds Noirs demanded de Gaulle, it wasn't clear how he would solve the Algerian crisis. And once in power, he was actually incredibly vague for a series of months. He didn't talk about independence on the one hand, but he called for a plebiscite, for a vote on whether or not different colonial possessions wanted to remain part of the French orbit, but also with more autonomy. It's a very interesting and complex vote in which, at least in theory, most of the French sort of colonial possessions, except for one, voted to stay in, the French orbit, and that included Algeria. So this is happening. He didn't speak of independence, but he called for a plebiscite, which also included Muslim voters in Algeria, which upset the settlers. He also began to dismantle this shadow government that was being led by Salan and Massou, and he opened channels of conversation and negotiation with the Algerian revolutionaries. We'll talk more next week about the kind of Algerian endgame that this ultimately leads to. But what's very important for now and for Fanon is that it's in this context that Fanon then becomes one of the diplomatic representatives of the FLN. In September 1958, he travels secretly to Rome, and the goal of that trip was to help to establish what was known as the GPRA, essentially the revolutionary Algerian government, more or less operating in exile. The FLN, meanwhile, is still fighting. It's actually bringing the fight to Paris. There are a number of shootings and bombings and attacks all across France that was really unprecedented at this point. But it was also at the same time becoming clear that negotiations of some kind would be inevitable. In December of 1958, Fanon represented the FLN at the All-African People's Congress in Accra, in Ghana. Formerly the Gold Coast, Ghana was at this point the center of Pan-Africanism on the continent. Since its independence the previous year, this is the same Ghana where Du Bois would move in 1961 to spend his last years. And it was the first independent nation in sub-Saharan Africa. So Ghanaian independence triggered struggles all across the continent as well, and further demands for independence. Fanon is speaking in Accra in December 1958. Now he gets a standing ovation for what is essentially a brazen statement on the importance of violence in the revolutionary struggle. And it was brazen, it was complicated, it was a little scandalous because Nkrumah, the president, had been putting forward and advocating nonviolent options, forms of nonviolent struggle and negotiation toward independence. By March 1959, then a few months later, Fanon was back in Rome for a very different kind of meeting, however. This is the second Black Writers' Congress that he had attended, for example, in Paris just a couple of years earlier. And this was still very much a meeting still anchored in negritude, relatively apolitical, although the conversation was less about a pre-colonial past and more about a kind of post-colonial future. And it's here that Fanon, the only reason I mention is that it's here that Fanon begins to write on national culture. And the essay that he delivers in Rome in 1959 is a sort of stinging rebuke of negritude, which he had at this point become fully critical of. Many of the sort of negritude representatives who were also heads of state in Africa didn't show up to the Ghana conference. They were less politically interested. Many of them supported the vote for remaining within the French orbit, including people like Aimé Césaire. And so Fanon at this point is incredibly frustrated with negritude, and he's leaning into this question of what national identity and national culture means. So this speech is then reproduced later in harsher terms in The Wretched of the Earth. In May 1959, so we're getting up toward the publication of A Dying Colonialism, in May 1959, Fanon travels to Morocco to reorganize FLN medical services near the border, where he's seriously injured in a car crash. He is transported to Rome, and this is important because when in Rome, he narrowly avoids 2 assassination attempts. The first, a car bomb, not necessarily or strictly targeting him, but the person he was going to meet. There was a bomb in their car that explodes. And then when he's in the hospital being treated, he realizes that he's been mentioned in the newspaper. He asks for his room to be changed. And then a gunman goes to the room that he had been in an attempt to kill him, right? So there are 2 assassination attempts while he is in the hospital in Rome that, in theory at least, were either carried out by what's called Les Mains Rouges, the Red Hand, a settler, a right-wing settler organization that's worked in conjunction with the French secret services, intelligence services as well. Cool. 1959, Fanon publishes finally A Dying Colonialism. Now, this is a book that had many titles, that had different contents and different kinds of form that are worth, I think, parsing out. The book, very interestingly, was initially going to be called Reality of a Nation. And I underline that because the concept of reality in anti-colonial struggle is an incredibly important one. It's central to Jose Carlos Mariátegui's 7 interpretive essays on Peruvian reality. The concept of reality becomes very essential for someone like Amilcar Cabral when he's trying to talk about the starting point for revolutionary struggle, which is to say anti-colonial revolutionaries need to analyze and understand and do a material analysis of their own context as a way of beginning to develop the sort of categories and frameworks that are necessary for their struggle, right? Instead of simply importing them, it's one that begins from reality. Fanon saw that that title had sort of been used in a similar book. He didn't want it to be confused with with his own, and so eventually settled on the French L'Ensemble, the year 5 of the Algerian Revolution. It's then published at some point in English as Sociology of Revolution, or in French as well, Sociology of a Revolution. It's not a Sociology of the Revolution, so it's a very interesting decision. And then in English, published either as A Dying Colonialism or Studies in a Dying Colonialism. Many different titles. It's all more or less the same book. But I want to speak for a moment on the title Year 5, right? L'Ensemble, Year 5 of the Algerian Revolution. On the one hand, by saying Year 5, he's simply saying something very concrete, right? He's saying this is the 5th year of the Algerian Revolution. And he says it, very clearly in the beginning of the preface, right? He says the Algerian War will soon be entering its 6th year. First and foremost, to call it Year 5 is an allusion to the sort of idea of the French revolutionary calendar that views revolution as carte blanche, right? The beginning of a new era, a historical rupture. So when you say Year 0, this is when a revolution is beginning. Year 5 is a new mode of counting the progress and the transformation. So it's meant to indicate a clear rupture from the past. In other words, November 1st, 1954 being the moment at which this new mode of counting begins. But there's a lot more we could say about this question of radical novelty, about what it sort of leaves behind, and what's dangerous about thinking of revolution in terms of something like a radical novelty. But I also want to say that for those who took our seminar last semester on the Black Jacobins, you may remember that I'd also mentioned this title in relation to a phrase that C.L.R. James uses in the Black Jacobins when he writes about how far what he called the revolutionary locomotive in Haiti had traveled in 5 short years. And we reflected last semester a little bit on the kind of peculiarity of the 5th year of a revolutionary process. Now, remember that Fanon's insistence from the very beginning is that all human things are a question of time. And when we take that seriously, we know that on the one hand, time is sort of elastic, it expands, it contracts, but we also know that certain things are relatively finite, right? When it comes to a revolution, 2 years is not nearly enough to begin to measure what has changed. But at a certain point, things need to be in motion if inertia and exhaustion are not going to set in. So there's something about this 5-year period, I think, that speaks to the reality of a revolutionary process. And this book is precisely about what changes during a revolutionary process, how astonishingly quickly those things can change once set into motion. While the metaphor that James uses of the locomotive is very Jamesian and not very Fanonian, and it's kind of like mechanical, sort of hydraulic implications, the parameters and the content fundamentally are the same. Because what James is saying is like, this is 5 years of a revolution that has moved at such a speed that these formerly enslaved people are not going backwards, right? It's a question of the development of people within the course of that process and how the process changes everyone involved and quickly. Fanon dictates this book very quickly. He was likely finishing the preface around the time that he was injured and in the hospital. He had initially asked the head of the GPRA, Farhad Abbas, to write a preface for it. And the reason he asked this is very interesting. It's because Fanon is still not very well known, right? His first book published, Black Skin, White Masks, was known to a few, not a huge success, and also very, very different from this form of writing. He was still also not very well known publicly as a spokesperson of the FLN. So he was not well known, and he was hoping that this preface from the head of the GPRA would help launch it, into the sphere of being an official representation of Algerian sort of revolutionary politics. But Abbas didn't like it. He encouraged him kind of sarcastically to ask one of the colonels, in other words, the sort of military leaders on the ground, to write a preface for it. The reality, though, is that Fanon didn't necessarily trust those colonels. He wasn't very close to them. Very important side piece here is the fact that Fanon was very close in Tunisia to a man named Aban Ramdan, and they both represented what was, in some senses, the hard line of the Algerian revolutionary movement, right? The sort of most hardcore revolutionary wing. And Ramdan himself had in 1957 had been lured into a trap and murdered essentially by one of these same colonels, right? So there were very dangerous tensions within the revolution that Fanon himself had to navigate and be aware of. In the end, he wrote his own preface to this, but the preface was not published in the book originally. And this is despite the fact that this book was published by Francois Maspero. And it was published by Maspero because no other press essentially would publish Third World revolutionary documents at this time. No other press would provide a platform to the FLN. So Maspero, created an entirely new press and an entirely new series and publishing house that became synonymous eventually with Third Worldist revolutionary publications. And this was one of the first pieces. Despite that, again, Maspero did not include his preface when he sent it off to publication, most likely because it contained the following line: "The death of colonialism means both the death of the colonized man and the death of the colonizer." Now, if you know Fanon, you know that this is an incredibly universalist message. What he means is that these subject positions, these structural realities, disappear in the course of a revolution. There is no more colonizer, there is no more colonized, you have free people, right? Of course, this is very likely to be misread as a call for violence and incitement to violence, which is exactly what Maspero had feared. And I think of, lots of cases in this country of similar kinds of paranoia, or sort of Comrade Noel Ignatieff, among others, who got in a lot of trouble many years ago for a journal called Race Trader, whose sort of, slogan was abolish the white race, right? And the right had all these sort of freakouts where they thought abolish the white race meant to sort of literally kill all white people. A similar scandal some years later when it came to the concept of white genocide and the sort of paranoias that are built into this sort of concept, so precious to the far right. Despite his own preface being axed, the book was seized by police 3 months after publication, so it didn't really matter. The same thing would happen to The Wretched of the Earth, and during this period, half of the books that were censored by the French government were published by Maspero. So he's just like pumping out these books of third worldist revolutionary literature only to have them immediately seized by the police. And they had all these strategies for sort of getting around it that were very sort of ingenious. A Dying Colonialism is not really about the FLN. It's more about the impact of the revolution on everyday people and their lives. And what's very interesting and related to the question of the press is that, Fanonism and third worldism were not even really things prior to this book. And in many senses, you can read this book as launching the idea and the identity of being a Fanonist revolutionary out into the world for the very first time. And doing so because it was the very first real look into the Algerian Revolution. So it shaped the way that an entire generation understood the Algerian Revolution, its meaning, and its dynamics. Now, Fanon begins his preface with the kind of sober concession that, as he puts it, 5 years of struggle have brought no political change. 5 years of struggle have brought no political change. Doesn't sound like that's going to be the message of the book. So what is he saying? The emphasis here being, of course, on the political, because as we already know, the book is fundamentally about nothing so much as the revolutionary and radical change that's already happening below the surface of the political. And Fanon goes on in his preface to make what I think are maybe 4 really essential points. The first is that the revolution has already been won. Again, very interesting to understand it in that sense. The form has not changed. There's been no change of the political structure, but on the level of content and substance, the revolution for Fanon has already been won. And not only has it already been won, but it is, as he puts it, irreversible. The revolution has been won and it is irreversible. This is the reality, as he describes it, no matter how obstinately the French decide to neglect that and to refuse it. As he puts it, a new society has come into birth, a new humanity. We shall show that the form and the content of national existence already exist in Algeria, and there can be no turning back. Something fundamentally new has been born. The Algerians already consider themselves sovereign. It remains for France to recognize her. Again, recognize here is a really interesting term, right? Legal recognition, but also thinking in terms of the legacies of Hegelian sort of dialectics, right? When does recognition come, if not at the end of an explosive struggle, if at all? The second question, what is the substance? What is the content that has changed so dramatically? And how could it possibly be considered to be irreversible in Fanon's words? If you look at page 30, there is a new kind of Algerian man, a new dimension to his existence. And then he continues, the thesis that men change at the same time that they change the world has never been so manifest as it is now in Algeria. Again, one of CLR James' fundamental preoccupations in the Black Jacobins was this question. He starts from it, he returns to it multiple times, right? How do we understand people as making the world and being made by it in the same time, right? As transforming and leading a revolution, but also as being sort of themselves the product of that revolution, and specifically Toussaint Louverture, produced by the revolution and sort of main leader of that process. Fanon's trying to answer the same question, or almost the same question. It's slightly different, right? Because James starts with the figure of Toussaint and then sort of moves it toward the broader question of a social process, whereas Fanon is concerned with, in a sense, pure process, a sort of organic revolutionary transformation of an entire society without any specific or identifiable leader. The third point on page 31, colonialism has definitely lost and the colonized have definitely won because some things don't move backwards. 2/3 of the way down on that page, 31, Fanon writes, it's a really amazing passage. An army can at any time reconquer the ground lost, but how can the inferiority complex, the fear and the despair of the past be reimplanted in the consciousness of the people? How can the inferiority complex be reimplanted, right? Some things don't move backwards. And here, of course, the inferiority complex goes all the way back to Fanon's earliest work. This concern with what colonialism tries to produce in the consciousness of the colonized. Henceforth, on page 32, Fanon writes, the power of the Algerian Revolution resides in what he calls the radical mutation that the Algerian has undergone. So this irreversible transformation of the Algerian people, their consciousness, is a radical mutation in Fanon's description. Finally, the Algerian Revolution is not a particular but a universal struggle. It is not a sort of cycle of barbarism, as he puts it at the bottom of page 32. These new relations are not the result of one barbarism replacing another barbarism, of one crushing of man replacing another crushing of man. And here Fanon is reaching back out toward his sort of permanent orientation toward radically universal horizons, human reconciliation, human unity. In the most brutal of contexts, he's still reaching out in that way, right? He says, what we Algerians want to discover is the man behind the colonizer. This man who is both the organizer and the victim of a system that has choked and reduced him to silence. As for us, we have long since rehabilitated the Algerian colonized man. We have wrenched the Algerian man from a centuries-old and implacable oppression. We have risen to our feet and we are now moving forward. Who can settle us back into servitude? We want an Algeria open to all, in which every kind of genius may grow, right? So this is a universal project, both in its scope, both in what we expect to then be the question of who is to be involved in this revolutionary process. And it's also universal because it's part and parcel of the development of a new humanity more broadly. A Dying Colonialism goes on to document along different parameters how this radical mutation occurs, this process of becoming both a very different kind of human, but also becoming more human in the process. And we'll turn to one of those in a second, but I want to take a moment to sort of answer any questions that folks have in the room about the history, the framing of dying colonialism, before we move into the question specifically of the veil. What are folks thinking about? We can take a few in the space.
I just have a question on like page 23, where Fanon says that the Algerian War, the most hallucinatory that any people has ever waged against aggression. And I was just asking like why he said hallucinatory, and was it because on page 31 he said colonialism shuts its eyes to the real facts of the problem. I was just like wondering why he uses hallucinatory when it like has very real consequences. He was like describing like the kid who was like shown like the like watch his parents get killed, and I was just wondering like why he uses hallucinatory there when he's like documenting really real like shit that happens to people.
We have more questions in the space. Cool. I can start with that, and then if we've got any on the feed, we can bring them up. it's very interesting, and I love the way you raised it because it's also making me think twice, right? I don't speak French very well, I'll be super clear about that. I speak Spanish though, and so my assumption was always that, that this was kind of like, you know, a term that doesn't translate very well into English, like alucinante, right? Like it's like awe-inspiring, like really sort of like a mind-blowing kind of war, right? But at the same time, what you're raising, and I think what you're raising in a really interesting way, is the fact that Fanon is using a lot of terminology in very precise ways, in very interesting ways, right? When he talks about mutation, right? When previously he talks in medical terms as a kind of metaphor, but a very precise kind of metaphor to get at what he's trying to explain. And of course, he's saying hallucinatory in a context where he is really talking about people who are hallucinating as well, right? So, you know, it could be the sort of difficulty of translation. It could also be the fact that he's, you know, playing with a sort of double meaning, right? A precise meaning, a metaphorical meaning, awe-inspiring, and also literally provoking of hallucinations, right? And so thank you so much for the question. We have some in the chat? Cool.
So is it okay if I just dump all four?
Let's fucking go.
Okay. The first one
Dump all four.
says that you may have touched on this previously, but could you say a bit about who were the French settlers? Were these ordinary French folk? What was the incentive to settle in Algeria? Good?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Second one. Was Algeria a settler colony like South Africa, not necessarily requiring ethnic cleansing like North America or Palestine?
Can you reread it very quickly?
Mm-hmm. Was Algeria a settler colony like South Africa, not necessarily requiring ethnic cleansing like North America or Palestine?
Okay.
Good?
Yep.
Okay. Can you share more about what you were alluding to about Fanon's applied psychiatry? About what Fanon's applied psychiatry is looking like at this point?
Mm-hmm.
And then lastly, what role did a nation like Italy play for Fanon in the Algerian struggle? How did inter-European differences benefit the revolutionaries of this time period?
Mm-hmm. These are good questions. I don't know much about that I can say about the role of Italy, except that it was a relatively safe place for the FLN fighters to be meeting. They were still meeting very quietly, but you know, for example, when Fanon arrives in Rome and he's injured, they're sort of like met by a sort of group of carabinieri, the sort of, you know, the police, and they're thinking the worst. But what's actually happened is that this bomb has gone off. They said, no, actually, you were the target of this. So they were attempting to at least, you know, maintain a degree of neutrality. And this is, of course, in a period in which Italian politics are very fraught, but also sort of have a lot of radical potential. If you look at the flight paths that the FLN sort of representatives have to take in order to be safe and to travel, for example, to Ghana, it was incredibly grueling. They had to fly to sort of 4 different countries in order to avoid those countries where they might be arrested. I don't want to say too much about the applied psychiatry in Tunisia, just because there's so much going on, and you know, there's a million things you could say about it. But essentially, Fanon is working both in a clinic where he is attempting to sort of recreate what he was doing in Blida to try to sort of deinstitutionalize or transform the institution as much as he can. He's also confronting, you know, resistance from the head of the clinic, who is a very sort of interesting and, you know, conservative person on a certain level, apparently very anti-Semitic. At a certain point, accuses Fanon of being a Zionist as a way to try to get him sort of thrown out of the clinic, but it doesn't work. And so Fanon is hitting some resistance there in his attempts to sort of transform that institution, but he's also expanding into a medical hospital where he's setting up a sort of outpatient clinic that is treating people in different kinds of ways, that's attempting to recreate some of the you know, questions around creating of new social interactions and new social structures. There are new challenges that emerge from that, but also a lot of advances that are made in terms of how Fanon and his collaborators understand the way they're treating their patients. He's also able to treat FLN militants in the clinic. It creates a space where it's a lot more sort of porous. People can come in and leave. So he's treating people, he's treating former nurses, he's treating former soldiers. And the reality is that a lot of his observations that go into a dying colonialism are things that he couldn't himself have observed, right? So he is sort of gleaning those from conversations, either with patients who are part of the FLN or through his conversations with, with the leadership as well. If I get the point of the question about South Africa versus the U.S., it's that in reality, these are different kinds of settler colonies, right? They're both settler colonies. One is more explicitly genocidal in the sort of, question of the logic of elimination, right? Which is famously the final logic of settler colonialism, is one of total elimination, of course, very effectively accomplished in places like the United States and built into places like Algeria and South Africa. But if you do want to compare it to something, South Africa is more apt, right? Because instead of fully attempting to displace and genocide the entirety of a population, there's a bit more of an attempt to subject that population to forced labor, to create a situation in which the French settlers, and again, we're talking about nearly 1 million, are living off the labor of Algerians, right? In Critique of Dialectical Reason, Sartre identifies this as a sort of fundamental contradiction of colonialism, which is that it ultimately wants to destroy the colonized person, but that's the source of its kind of labor at the same time, right? I think for US settler colonialism, we know that that's not a contradiction at all, right? Because what is wanted in some modes of settler colonialism is not labor at all, but land. So there's a sort of spectrum from land to labor and resources into which settler colonies fall. Again, it's important to position Algeria as a settler colony because that's what changes the politics of the struggle. That's what makes it the ferocious struggle that it is. That's what makes France defend it. At the same time, it's not all the way, to the level of a settler colony as you see in something like the US. As to who were the French settlers, lots of different French settlers. Some were people who have been convicted of crimes. I think there were sort of lots of exiles. There were people who've been exiled to Algeria for having, been communists and revolutionaries. There were lots of folks who left the country during the resistance. So there's a lot of people who are in Algeria for different reasons. I'm not exactly sure what to do with that, right? You've got famous philosophers, you've got Camus, you've got Jacques Derrida, you've got a whole range of people living there, but living on this foundation, which ultimately has to be directed in a certain kind of direction, if that makes sense. For Fanon, there's a telos to settler colonialism, which is that you can only maintain that situation up to a certain point, and especially when resistance begins to emerge, you have to pick a side, right? Camus, famous philosopher, very famously, even more famously, refuses to pick a side and becomes rather infamous for that. And very few white settlers ultimately are on the side of the revolution, but some are. And that's something we'll talk about next week. Cool. So we're talking about the radical mutation. And we're beginning with the most famous and most controversial by far chapter of A Dying Colonialism, which is Algeria Unveiled, or more literally, Algeria Unveils Herself, right? It's more active sort of phrasing. Now, I think it's important, especially for Americans, to understand that the question of the Islamic veil is not a question of the past. It's an incredibly active and hugely relevant question today, and particularly in a place like France, right? France is a country that has long claimed to be the secular inheritor of the legacy of the French Revolution, right? But which remains deeply Catholic and fundamentally Islamophobic. So you have these sort of secular claims about society providing cover for a sort of violent racism where the veil is banned, where people attack women on the street and police attack women and are tearing off their veils. This was happening, to a sort of very high level, maybe like a decade ago. And so this is not something that is very distant in the past. In the debates that periodically surface around the question, the meaning of the veil, again here, but also in a powerful way in Europe, we tend to see two very opposing sorts of views. On the one hand, that the veil is objectively a sign of patriarchal domination. The veil is bad, in other words. or on the other side, that it's a sort of expression of a kind of individual choice or a different form of particular freedom, right? The veil is good for this or that kind of reason. But both tend to present it as sort of objectively true in either case, or as having a kind of essential meaning. Now, Fanon is not going to understand it that way, of course. He's instead going to lay out a progression, if we want to call it a dialectic, we can call it a dialectic, of struggles in and around the question of the veil that move through a series of steps that dynamically and radically transform the meaning of the veil in Algeria. That's the key point, right? And keep an eye on this, because this is going to be the pattern that Fanon lays out in each of these chapters around the different elements identified. The veil, the radio, medicine, the family, right? Each is going to be set into motion. Each is going to be a quasi-inert phenomenon that gains a kind of dynamic and transformative capacity in the course of a revolutionary struggle, right? So, what are the stages roughly of this progression? And you could think of different stages, you could think of 5, kind of trying to simplify it down to the question of more or less 3 stages of the veil. Stage 1, prior to the revolution, he dates it around the 1930s, colonialism is seeking to actively disintegrate the unity of Algerian society, or to destructure it, as he puts it. To do so, it explicitly targets women. Its sociologists, its ethnologists identify and discover what they refer to as a matrilineal essence below the apparently patriarchal surface, arguing that women constitute the pivot of Algerian society. There's this sort of quote, this is at the bottom of page 37. This enabled the colonial administration to define a precise political doctrine. If we want to destroy the structure of Algerian society, we must first of all conquer the women. We must go and find them behind the veil where they hide themselves, and in the houses where the men keep them out of sight. Right? Now, Fanon is not offering here or making a statement on whether or not this question of matrilineal essence is true, whether it really existed. That actually isn't fundamentally the point for Fanon. And we know from US experience, and here I'm thinking specifically of like the 1965 Moynihan report, that identifying matriarchy isn't always a compliment. In the US context, you know, Black women were identified as upholding a matriarchal structure, which was seen as sort of pathological and destructive of the Black family. And this was used to sort of dictate US social policy in the 1960s in an incredibly troubling way. But we do know that this has been true of many societies, that there's an incredibly important matriarchal power structure and foundation. And we also know that colonialism systematically targets women, specifically targets women, recognizing their power as the foundation and the need to destroy that foundation. And here I'm thinking, on the one hand, there's lots of different resources to look at for this. Angela Davis talks very clearly about the role of the Black women in the community of slaves as holding that community together in a certain kind of sense, and talks of sexual violence as a weapon to use against women as a way of attacking the entire community, right? Sarah Deer, an indigenous scholar, talks about very similar questions in the context of North American settler colonialism, the way that women were seen as a both representing the continuity of indigenous communities, and as representing matriarchal power brokers when it came to controlling certain commercial circuits. So they had to be, again, attacked very directly. Both see this in terms of both a metaphorical and a concrete process of rape, since sexual violence is used as a weapon to destroy the coherence of the community. And we're going to see that, especially on a symbolic level, this is crucial for how Fanon understands the Algerian question as well. And the French, the perspective of the French male settler, right? For whom there's a violent desire that coalesces around the veil, or what's called the haïk, and a desire to forcibly tear off the veil in order to visually possess Algerian women. The French man in Algeria demands the right to see. He demands access. And he demands what Fanon, again in very Hegelian terms, describes as reciprocity. Again, remember, reciprocity is precisely what is denied by the racist gaze to begin with, right? And yet the feeling of being denied that is upsetting for the French white settler. This is a question fundamentally about possession, right? This is the first, piece. In this first phase, however, this doesn't necessarily entail a violent assault on women, even if that's built into the kind of logic of it. Instead, the colonial strategy is to, as they put it, defend women. This is over on page 38. We must defend, they undertook to defend this woman, pictured as humiliated, sequestered, cloistered. They need to defend her from medieval and barbaric institutions, right? It sends in charities, mutual aid societies, NGOs, experts to analyze the ways in which the community itself is the problem, right? This sort of repressive structure of this patriarchal community, leaving aside the fact that there's a contradiction here between the matrilineal essence and the patriarchal power structure. And this requires, again, the condemnation, the symbolic condemnation of the entire community, which colonialism is trying to destructure, right? It, in Fanon's words, confines the Algerian within a circle of guilt. Now, this is the kind of imperial feminism we're very familiar with, right? That has been used to justify military intervention in Afghanistan, today in Iran. But it's also about the very same kind of NGOs, professional, charitable foot soldiers who are doing this work. It distributes food, Fanon writes, but also a kind of enlightenment. In other words, hegemonic arguments about the inhumanity of the veil. It argues, and it's built on the assumption that Algerian men couldn't be turned until the Algerian women were turned first. And so it becomes incredibly essential to the most essential means of destructuring Algerian culture, in Fanon's terms. And the key to what he calls, in the choice of words, is clear: colonial penetration, which, quote, revealed to them piece by piece the flesh of Algeria laid bare, right? This is not just metaphor. If the French man played a key role in demanding unveiling, this is sort of forcible unveiling that's happening, we have the opposite reaction from many French women after the unveiling begins. This is very ironic. It's a little side note that Fanon puts in there, but very revealing. After Algerian women, in response to this, begin to unveil themselves, then they're criticized by white women for being too exposed, for being too sexual. Of course, there's a question of threat that's involved in there as well. Needless to say, Algerian women cannot win at this losing game. But thankfully for Fanon, the assimilationist game is not the game at hand. That's stage one, right? Targeting women for an unveiling campaign with the goal of destructuring Algerian society for colonial ends. In stage two, things change direction quickly. Turn to page 46 and 47. You can see, if you look at my page 47, it's completely scribbled all over because things get very, very interesting. The attempt at destructuring Algerian society generates a powerful reaction. This is starting on the bottom of page 46. We've seen that colonial society, the colonial strategy of destructuring Algerian society comes to assign a prominent place to the Algerian woman. The relentless methods of struggle were bound to give rise to reactionary forms of behavior on the part of the colonized. In the face of the violence of the occupier, the colonized found himself defining a principled position with respect to a formerly inert element of the native cultural configuration. It was the colonialist frenzy to unveil the Algerian woman. It was his gamble on winning the battle of the veil at whatever cost that were to provoke the natives' bristling resistance. Again, bristling is a term we've seen like 5 or 6 times now. I say, like it's standing kind of on end. The deliberate aggressive intentions of the colonialists with respect to the haik gave new life to this dead element of Algerian cultural stock. Here he makes clear that his analysis of what's happening in Algeria is not separate from his previous concerns around blackness and black identity when he writes, "It is the white man who creates the Negro, but it is the Negro who creates negritude." In other words, the reaction that comes. To the colonialist offensive against the veil, the colonized opposes the cult of the veil. What was an undifferentiated element in a homogeneous whole acquires a taboo character, and the attitude of a given Algerian woman with respect to the veil will be constantly related to her overall attitude with respect to the foreign occupation, right? What does this mean? It means that the colonizer activates the veil by targeting women, focusing all of their energy onto the veil, which was the only way they could possibly understand Algerian women to begin with. In the course of doing that, they activated the veil and gave it a new meaning, right? And that meaning came to be an anti-colonial meaning. A formerly inert object, or one that did not possess of such a political meaning, suddenly had that in a colonial context, and it was set into motion in the process. Concretely, what does this mean? It means that women who were maybe neutral toward the veil, ambivalent about the veil, even many who had previously rejected it, now embraced it, began to wear it, because it was a symbol of resistance against colonialism, right? This is where the meaning becomes kind of inverted. And it was the colonizer, again, that gave the veil that meaning in this moment. And again, there are general pieces of what's happening that we're going to see repeated throughout the book, and there are more specific elements that we'll talk about today. Now, this is really where things begin to get moving. Concretely, meaning the Battle of Algiers, the bombing campaign that's happening in the European sector, and symbolically, the movement of meanings, the struggle that this struggle is propelling forth. These are the two questions that we're trying to hold in relationship to each other, which is to say, in the next third stage, the veil becomes a key component of the struggle itself. Now, there's a couple of things here. Fanon is not exactly right when he says that women weren't part of a struggle from the beginning. That's not true. There are other pieces where, again, there's a very controversial chapter. There are other pieces where Fanon is attempting to phenomenologically account for how Algerian women must have felt in this or that moment. Very difficult, impossible for him to do, right? And so there are many ways in which he either missteps or makes mistakes. But from day one, he was close to the truth when he begins to talk about the increasing importance of FLN women, in the course of the bombing campaigns in the European quarter. Again, all of this is very vividly portrayed in the film Battle of Algiers. As combat intensifies and the city is divided by military checkpoints and barricades, the FLN is forced to innovate on a tactical level. Women wearing the haik are able to conceal documents, guns, grenades, and bombs, all of which requires, and this is important to understand, requires practice and skill to carry a heavy bomb through a checkpoint under a veil, but while seeming like you're not carrying anything, right? The veil in this moment had become weaponized. But this isn't the end of the dialectic either, because once the bombs begin to explode, once the polarization sets in, the French soon realize what's happening, and they begin to search veiled women at the checkpoints. Tactics needed to change once again. And this is when we come to the incredibly memorable scene in Battle of Algiers, when young FLN women remove their veils, cut and bleach their hair, put on makeup, put on Western-style clothing to carry even more bombs across the checkpoints. Now, for Fanon, this requires more than just a cosmetic transformation. Returning to what we now know again to be a long-standing interest of his, he speaks of what he calls the dialectic of the body and the world. There's a lot of really interesting passages on this, but if you look over at page 58, Fanon writes right in the middle of the page, carrying revolvers, grenades, hundreds of false identity cards or bombs, the unveiled Algerian woman moves like a fish in the western waters. The soldiers, the French patrols, smile to her as she passes. Compliments on her looks are heard here and there, but no one suspects that her suitcases contain the automatic pistol which will presently mow down 4 or 5 members of one of those patrols, right? And on the bottom of page 59, he writes, the Algerian woman who walks stark naked into the European city, again metaphorically, of course, relearns her body, reestablishes it in a totally revolutionary fashion. This new dialectic of the body and of the world is primary. Right? This is something, again, that he had been concerned with on a fundamental level. Remember that his own body-world dialectic is fundamentally undermined by existing in a racist world, right? How to adjust the movement of your body to a world which rejects you on a fundamental level. So on the one hand, when Fanon speaks in these terms here, he's underlining first the kind of radical mobility of cultural artifacts, in this case the veil, showing that they can and do assume new meaning in the course of the anti-colonial struggle. And while this meaning follows the rough parameters of kind of activation, counter-assimilation, and resistance, what he's showing in reality is the fact that items like the veil, traditions, beliefs, none of these actually have essential or fixed meanings, right? That's point number one, which is incredibly important for Fanon. But he's also saying something far broader, which is that the question of the veil opens onto the question of the Algerian woman as a whole, her relationship to her family, her community, and her revolution. And that, in other words, this reconfiguration of her body-world dialectic isn't just any configuration. It's a better one. It's a more confident one. It's one in which she fits more comfortably into the contours of a world in transformation. That's the veil. We didn't get to the radio this week. We'll talk about it next week. When we get into the rest of these chapters, right, again, on particularly the questions on the radio, medicine, and the family, we'll see the way that the pattern and the framework that Fanon has laid out on the question of the veil will be reproduced in a certain way, right? It'll be reproduced inversely in the chapters on what you could understand as being European phenomena, meaning radio and medicine, right, where there's a rejection at first and then an embrace, a dialectic of kind of resistance, incorporation, adaptation. And then there's a final chapter on the European minority, which is really interesting to think about, A, what he's saying in that chapter, and B, why he's writing that chapter, why it's being included, right? I'll take a few more questions in a second. The last thing I'll say is that I did receive a question by email from Michael in Vienna about how all this relates to Palestinian resistance today. We'll talk more about that soon, right? But I hope and I feel like the contours of how it relates are already beginning to emerge, and they're all right below the surface. So we'll stop there and we'll take some more questions to wrap things up.
I'm on 39. It's the ending paragraph that goes into page 40. Yeah, I was just curious of what you make of this paragraph, because in the paragraph before, there's not a European worker who does not sooner or later, in the give or take of relations on the job site, the shop, or the office, ask ritual questions, which are discriminatory. But you kind of lost me at the holiday party invite. Can you dissect that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it seems like something he's probably gone through, right?
Right.
Experience that he's had, or he's witnessed, because he's not, Algerian, but has been at these kind of holiday parties. Right, the description is right, is the way that this sort of circle of guilt gets kind of wrapped around the Algerian, right? How it gets, wrapped around the men, how the men are also then targeted by this criticism, and specifically how in the workplace, if Algerian man is working with a French sort of settler or a French person, he says inevitably the French person will be like, oh, by the way, does your wife wear the veil? Like, why don't you let her do things? Why don't you give her freedom? And then the question of the holiday party is like, well, why don't you invite her? Like, why do you have these sort of different cultural structures that require explaining because of this demand by French society? And I mean, it's a really interesting description. He calls it a formal summons, right? Like, you are required to respond to this. If he comes with his wife, it means admitting defeat. If he doesn't, then it means sort of like sacrificing or jeopardizing his own position in the job. So, and then he goes on to say, even more interestingly, that when it comes to what he calls intellectuals, by which he means kind of doctors and lawyers and more kind of educated Algerians, he said this very quickly becomes a racial logic. And what's so interesting is that he says it becomes a racial logic because the French person has to sort of explain to themselves how this sort of educated or otherwise so-called civilized person still, uses and engages in this institutional structure, right? And the race is what explains it, right? He's a doctor, but he's still an Arab, right? So that's where Fanon is sort of working through, again, what he calls this sort of like circle of guilt. Again, for Fanon, circle is crucial, right? In Black Skin, White Mask, he talks about himself being trapped and tied into this circle of whiteness, the circle being something you can't escape from without an explosion. Cool. Oh, sorry, we were supposed to collect questions. Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to Fanon's like interpersonal experience with the veil, and how like I'm curious about how his own relationships, like interpersonal relationship structures, are influenced and impacted by that, and if he if you know anything about kind of the interpersonal dynamics of his experience and how that reflects his writing.
Yeah. What else?
Are there any good auto or biographical works on Fanon or the Algerian Revolution?
Yeah. Yes. So there's a couple, right? Oh, we have one more. Great. Thank you. I keep trying to answer the questions. One.
And does this mirror like Du Bois's veil? I'm just curious. Is he like alluding to some of that?
Okay.
But
now you blew my mind. I'm glad I wrote down the other questions because now that's all I'm thinking about. On the biographical piece, David Macy wrote a big biography of Fanon. It's very useful. I mean, I think there's moments where, you may not like it, but it's a big, comprehensive biography. There's moments where biographers do this thing where they kind of try to like make like petty little jabs at someone to like prove that, they have something to say outside of just being a biographer. So there's a little bit of that, but it's good overall, right? And it's, it gives you a lot of detail. It's probably the most comprehensive biography in general. On Algeria, there's this book. Other folks may know it. I'm blanking on the name. It's something like Algeria, Capital of the Revolution, or something like that, which is only a few years old, but that's definitely worth looking into. Fanon's personal experience of the veil is very limited. I guess I'll put it that way. That's not to sort of say that he has no experience. His own, sort of positionality, circles that he operated in and worked in Blida, were inevitably skewed, right, toward, a sort of more white or more kind of metropolitan community. One of the difficulties, and this is where, like I said, there's a lot of controversy about this chapter on the veil, and a lot of the controversy really boils down to, listen, he doesn't really get certain aspects of it, right? He calls it, at a certain point, he calls it unmodifiable, and then, one of the responses, no, it's like modified all the time. There's tons of modifications. And part of what's confusing about it is that he's sliding sort of between an actual analysis of the veil and its importance in Algerian society and its importance for French settlers, right? So he's trying to describe the French perspective, which comes across as very, and is, this sort of homogenizing and racial sort of like gaze. That's one part of what he's doing. He's trying to, as I said, do a phenomenology of, again, how an Algerian woman who has just taken off her veil must feel when walking through the European part of the city. Very difficult to do if that's not you, right? Like if you're not an Algerian woman. And so, I think I would encourage, people to be a little patient with his phenomenological accounts of it, but to look at some of the critiques. I don't think any of the critiques really get to questioning the heart of what he's talking about, which are the very, very different meanings that the veil can assume in the course of the struggle. I think one final piece of the critique that's worth maybe emphasizing, and this is, I don't want people to take it sort of all the way necessarily, but it's sort of part of a broader question you can raise, is that he's painting some of these things as irreversible that were then reversed very quickly, right? I guess we put it that way. So there are lots of complications that emerge after the after the success of the revolution with its rollback. Fanon himself is very aware of the dangers of rollback after a revolution. That's something we'll talk about in the course of The Wretched of the Earth. But it should be understood in the context of the veil, I think, as well. How does it relate to Du Bois's veil? That's a super interesting question. Now, there's a couple pieces that get us sort of toward thinking about that question, right? One is that there are very interesting parallels between Du Bois and Fanon in general. Namely that their early work is, very roughly speaking, more universalist, more geared toward, in some senses, geared toward a middle class audience, and in some senses geared toward more of a white audience or a multiracial audience, right? Whereas in both of their cases, as they get older, their audience becomes very much, an audience where they don't necessarily care if white people are even reading what they're writing, or that it would matter. What does this mean? It means that phenomena that they diagnose in their early work has the sort of traces of this. Fanon himself has said, listen, the psychological question of struggles that I'm dealing with in black skin, white masks are characteristic of a middle class doctor from the Caribbean, right? Very specific. Even working class people in Martinique are not living the same life and experiencing what he's experiencing, which is very similar to what Du Bois is experiencing as double consciousness, right? Now, and there's people like, who have been very, very critical of the idea of double consciousness being an explicitly middle class phenomenon. Why? Because you have to care what America thinks about you to, be subject to that psychological kind of torment. However, when Du Bois begins to talk about the veil, I think, and I've always read it as something that's far more material, right? The veil is almost like the ontological division in the world. So the veil in Du Bois is more like what Fanon calls the ontological flaw, right? Du Bois says that he realized when he was young and this young white girl responded to him and refused his sort of card that he was trying to give her, that a vast veil descended across the world for him, and for the first time he realized that he was sort of othered by her, that he was not white, right? And so that's a very different kind of veil, but that's to emphasize that it's also a material phenomenon, I think, for Du Bois once he then develops it. This is in many ways a kind of inversion of that, right? And I love how Fanon says that what the French settler wants is reciprocity. Again, it's funny because that's literally what fucking white gaze denies Fanon, right? You can't have reciprocity. I don't look to you for reciprocity, but when that's not given back to you, right, there's a reaction to it, right? And I think white society does that in many, many different ways, right? The demand for, if you think about the way that, white people respond to not understanding a language that's being spoken near them, right? With a kind of fear or an anger or something's being kept from them, right? This is exactly what he's describing, right? And it's a lack of reciprocity. So I think it's an inversion of it, right? It's a sort of inverted version of a veil put toward very different purposes, I think. Do we have something in the feed?
We have two questions from the chat. If that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So the first one says, when Fanon talks about the dreams of European men, did he actually analyze them / have psychiatric sessions with them? And secondly, is Fanon throwing shade at Simone de Beauvoir? Sorry, I know I just pronounced it wrong. By developing this analysis of the veil.
They don't say any more about what they mean by that, right?
That's just it.
Yeah. Did he analyze? Well, on a certain level, yes, he'd certainly analyze European men in their dreams. I don't know to what degree, those dreams ended up being, specifically, because they were often about torture, they were about violence, they were about, all of these phenomena. Ultimately, of course, we know, he's got enough of a foot in psychoanalysis to know that dreams about violence are also dreams about sex, right? And so that's not something that would surprise him. I'm sure he's also doing some sort of, some speculation as to the structure of what's going on here, right? Which is to say, not so much in dreams, right, but in behaviors, he's seeing a manifestation of a demand for visibility, a demand for access. I think he's reading that very, very directly as reflecting a dream of conquest, right? Again, conquest is colonial, is sexual, right? And Fanon is seeing the two as working directly in conjunction with each other. That's all to say, I don't think he has to get very deep to actually be right about what European men are thinking in this context, because they're very transparent about it. And there's one thing that Fanon is constantly insisting, which is that where most psychoanalysis is really, trying to understand submerged phenomena. Part of what Fanon is trying to say is that often, not always, but often, things are much, much closer to the surface, right? Which is to say the settlers are much more likely to just say it, right? Or to be open about it, or to ask questions about it, or to pose, these kind of contradictions. I don't think, I'm not fully understanding the question about Simone de Beauvoir. De Beauvoir very, very famously is an incredibly important sort of existential feminist. Sartre's partner doesn't get enough credit, because of how sort of overbearing in multiple ways the figure of Jean-Paul Sartre was. And Fanon was very close to her, met with her in Italy and during one of these sort of trips. And I don't think he's throwing any kind of shade. I think if anything, they have very significantly overlapping understandings of the way that gender and colonialism work. But at the same time, it's important to understand that Fanon is also central to teaching many European radicals about what, how Algeria operates, right? French radicals. He pushes them. He had previously, as we saw in Black Skin, White Masks, severely critiqued Sartre on his understanding of the weighting of the dialectic. Here in this text, you see him saying things that sound a lot like what Sartre was saying, but it's partly because the transition has already begun to happen, right? We can talk more about this next week, but the category of negritude Fanon is trying to defend in Black Skin, White Masks in 1952. By 1956, 7, and 8, he is seeing what he understands to be the sort of transcendence of that category and the need to move on to something else, which is national consciousness, right? But it's important to understand that he defends that category because it's the moment to defend it, right? Him pressing Sartre in this way leads to a very different kind of framing that I'll talk about when I talk about Sartre's very famous preface to The Wretched of the Earth. Cool. Don't forget to stick around. We're gonna, view Sunny's, incredible interview with Mumia, and I will actually invite Sunny up to say a few words on the feed right now.
Is it on? Yeah, it's on. Yeah.
Got mine.
Everyone, unlike Gio, I do not have written stacks of notes to read off here, so this is like off the cuff. But hi, my name is Sunny. I've done a lot of work with the Mumia movement in Philly for the last 10 plus years as sort of like the unofficial documentarian for the movement. I've been wanting to speak to Mumia for quite a while and been sort of putting the feeler out through people who have that connection to make it happen. Figured it was kind of months away, but in early February, I suddenly found myself in a position where I could talk to him uncut for quite a period of time. So I did my best to be eloquent in my questions to him, but as you'll hear, he's very conversational. And if you've listened to him on prison radio, it's his radio broadcast voice, very powerful. But here you hear a side of him where he's, again, very conversational. He's laughing. You can feel him in the room with you. And it's just a side of him that I've never heard before. And I think one of the ironies about Mumia is, before his arrest, he was a award-winning journalist in Philadelphia, and during his trial and whatnot, people try to downplay his involvement and his role as a journalist, and to paint him as a cold-blooded killer or what have you. But I think one of the ironies is, through his work with prison radio, is they've amplified his voice quite a bit, and he's still able to do these amazing radio broadcasts and commentaries about what's happening, not just in the U.S. but across the world. And I know we didn't get to talk about the chapter on the radio, but I opened the piece with this quote from the introduction of Italian Colonialism, where Adolfo Gilli says, "The radio is an instrument of mass struggle. It has been transformed into a revolutionary implement as powerful as the gun." And for me, Mumia really just embodies that, because they tried to bury his voice and throw him in a cage, but he's still producing these commentaries that are resonating, and people are still holding on to every word that he says. So yeah, this interview is about 30 minutes. I don't know if anyone here has seen it. It was published a week ago. So hopefully, if you haven't seen it, you'll enjoy it. I did set up an email address for questions. Mumia does not have access to the email address, but the questions will be compiled and sent to him, and hopefully at some point and in some form we'll get him to respond. So if anyone here or on the stream has questions, you can send them to mumia.fanon@proton.me. Again, that's mumia.fanon@proton.me. So yeah, hopefully we will get that to him and he'll be able to respond to questions. So DJ, if you want to start the video on the stream, and I'll get it ready on here, and we're good to go. I recently had a 30-minute conversation with Mumia Abu-Jamal to talk about Frantz Fanon, the revolutionary writer and psychiatrist whose work on race and anti-colonial resistance is more relevant now than ever. We cover imperial violence, ICE, the Black Panther Party, the dystopian ramifications of AI, fear as a tool of empire, the abject failure of artists and culture producers to meet the moment, and the irreversible psychological effects of reading The Wretched of the Earth. Mumia is a veteran Black Panther who joined the Philadelphia chapter when he was just 15 years old as the Minister of Information. He's also an award-winning journalist and author of numerous books while incarcerated. Mumia will be 72 in April, and he has been in state prison since 1982, despite being both factually innocent and legally not guilty of the crime he was accused of committing. He continues to suffer elder abuse and medical neglect in the prison system. Locked in a cell for 23 hours a day, Mumia spends his time either writing his PhD dissertation on Fanon or performing autopsies on this dying empire through scathing commentaries and radio broadcasts on prison radio. We only scratch the surface, but underneath Mumia lies the unshakable bedrock that is Frantz Fanon.
This is a call from Pennsylvania State Correctional Institution, Mahanoy. This call is subject to recording and monitoring.
Frantz Fanon was the real deal Holyfield. And I say that because no one can read him, whether you're talking about The Wretched of the Earth, A Dying Colonialism, even Black Skin, White Masks in, certain parts. But you cannot read him without your brain like doubling in size and exploding, because this cat, he was a psychiatrist and he knew how to feed the brain. He knew how to reach people and hit them. And he actually had a technique for it, and he writes about it in The Wretched of the Earth. He calls it combat literature. And I don't remember reading that term anywhere else, but he intends to be provocative. And more importantly, he is a dedicated thinker, scholar, revolutionary, activist, psychiatrist, who relies on truth to transform consciousness. So he spits a bitter truth. And I think it's in Black Skin, White Masks where he says, I don't want my voice to be beautiful. I want it to be harsh, right? And so that's how he writes, right? He doesn't play a lot of games that writers, I'm going to, hug you tenderly and then, let you go. This guy says this is what this is. And if you go to The Wretched of the Earth, remember, he opens the book talking about there are two different species of humans in the world, the colonized and the colonizers. Wow. And, it begins from there, and it never, ever stops. And this was his remarkably short but powerful life. You ain't got to enjoy it because his voice is harsh, but you will learn and you will look at the world differently. That I can tell you. That I will promise you.
I think I was 22 the first time I read Wretched of the Earth, and as I stepped through that book, it honestly felt like I was stepping on landmines, destroying the self-hate that had grown inside myself, being a brown person growing up in a white suburb, that sort of self-hate that calcified inside of me internally. And reading it was the first time I had learned to love myself, honestly. And I've always wanted to ask you, what was your initial introduction to Fanon? How did you hear about him, and what was your initial reaction to reading him?
My introduction to Fanon was after I joined the party, and Huey P. Newton issued the order to all Panthers across the country that they must read The Wretched of the Earth. I didn't know then what I know now, that when the party was formed, when Bobby and Huey got together in Oakland in October of 1966 and began thinking about forming an organization, Bobby gave him a copy of The Wretched of the Earth, and he writes later in his book that Huey read the thing 6 times. 6 times. And, you know, after a while, when you're reading it like that, you stop reading and it begins reading you. I mean, it's in your consciousness. Most of the ideas that he framed in terms of ideology, politics, the lumpen, all of that came from Frantz Fanon, word for word, because it seared his brain. Here's the problem with black skin, white masks. In my study and read and reflection of black skin, white masks, and then The Wretched of the Earth, A Dying Colonialism, and other works by Fanon, I find that the man who wrote Black Skin, White Masks is not the man who wrote The Wretched of the Earth. Why do I say that? I say that because scholars have shown that Black Skin, White Mask was supposed to be his doctoral thesis. His advisors, who were doctors, who admired his remarkable brilliance, talked him out of that. And he did like a standard doctoral thesis on a medical problem and a psychological problem. But the man who wrote Black Skin, White Masks was a man wrestling with himself. He writes in that book, "What do I care about black nationalism? That's not me. I am a Frenchman. My culture is French. My language is French. France," this is a quote, a direct quote, "France is my religion." I can hardly repeat that word, repeat that line without laughing because it's so preposterous when you read The Wretched of the Earth, because he is another man when he writes The Wretched of the Earth. He is no longer a Frenchman. He speaks French because that's his, you know, the language of his youth and of his education. But in his mind, he is a combatant against the French Empire. When he wrote Black Skin, White Masks, he was what he would call a colonized subject. He said Martinicans went to France, you know, almost like, for them, it was almost like going to heaven. Except when they met French people, they learned that they weren't who they thought they were, because the French are the French, and you're either one of them or not. And if you're coming from their colonial possessions, you are not regarded as French, especially if your skin is dark, or you're brown or black or yellow when you think about it. So the consciousness that wrote that was the tortured consciousness of a colonized subject. When he broke out of that, when he was on his way to medical school in Lyon, in France, on the French equivalent of the GI Bill, his mind was exploded by a child who looked at him, and the little boy looked at his mother and said, "Mama, mama, un nègre. Mama, mama, a nigger." And it blew his mind. And he was never the same. And he writes about that in Black Skin, White Masks. He said, "My body was shattered into 1,000 pieces, and I tried to pull it all together, but it was a new me pulling it all together." And he was traumatized. His dream of what he thought France was not. And when he went to Algiers and he saw how his fellow doctors and psychiatrists treated the Algerian people, he knew what side he was on. You know, he not only tried to transform that medical system in Algiers, he joined the FLN and he worked underground, but he taught them how to survive torture. And, you know, and he treated torturers. It's in The Wretched of the Earth, you know, his medical files. So this extraordinary man, you know, was not the same man. So read Black Skin, White Masks with that knowledge and that caution, and it will speak to you. I first began reading him when I was a teenager. Two of my sons began reading Fanon when they were teenagers. The professor at University of Connecticut now, but he began reading when he was a teenager, and the guy who kind of invented Afro pessimism began reading when he was a teen. So when you're a teen and you read Fanon, your life is no longer the same.
Reading Fanon at 22 was like decolonizing my brain, and it's almost like there was a before me and after me, and that moment in time was reading Wretched of the Earth, and just the way that it literally rewired my brain.
That's it. And that's what it was designed to do. And that's why they have a new, and I think not a better translation, the Phil Cox translation. And it doesn't have the punch of the original. You know, when the original first came out, when it was new in the bookstores, and you went into a bookstore and you plucked it off the counter or off the table and you looked at the back cover, it would say, this book has been called the Bible of the Black Revolution.
Do you know French? Have you been able to read Wretched of the Earth in its original form?
I do know it enough to read it, yeah. And it is more powerful. And I think that, you know, translators do what translators do, but they bring their world with them. Fanon famously said, to lose a language is to lose a world. But the opposite is also true. To learn a language is to learn a world. And, you know, he was almost like Napoleon. I speak of them in the same breath a lot of times because Napoleon was not French, like ethnically. He was Italian. But he became more French than the French because he had to be. And Fanon, you know, being a West Indian and a Martinican, was as a young man more French than the French. And he had to become otherwise when he learned what being French really meant out of the mouth of babes. He was transformed. And he became, and this is one of my chapters, he became, after he went to Algiers, he became African. And that was a leap for him. But he made the leap successfully.
How do we read Fanon now in 2026? We're seeing genocides happening in Palestine and Sudan, and they're happening live on our phone screens. The U.S. is shredding international law and invading places like Venezuela and kidnapping their leaders and suffocating Cuba. And we're on the precipice of an illegal war with Iran. My question for you, someone who has studied Fanon quite extensively and as someone who has critiqued the empire from within a cage, literally, what sort of things do we maintain and hold that Fanon has taught us as we read him now in this current hellscape?
I think you must recognize something that's very fundamental that Fanon does not tell you there, at least. I think we're living in an epochal moment. This is a new moment, and things are happening today that did not happen yesterday, or things that happened yesterday are now happening again today. I think of this era as neo-imperialist. It's a new form, a new kind. And I said epochal because think of this. Capitalism was born when the royals and parliament and their financial businesses that donated to these sources stole the commons from the commoners, outlawed them from walking through royal lands and picking up pieces of wood. And what they tried to do and what they succeeded in doing was creating the working class. Now we're talking about England, the 19th century, and what they did was they terrified them into the obedience of a clock in a factory to make money, to make capital. And, you know, they used the law, they used the press, they used the weight of the royal classes to discipline the commoners, the common people, and they created the working class. We're at a stage right now where a non-human working class is being born, and they are just beginning. And because they're non-human, they don't sleep, they don't eat unless they consume energy. They will work 24 hours a day, and they will grow smarter exponentially in a matter of weeks. I'm talking about AI. And they will decimate the working class in this country and around the world. and they will make not billions, but trillions of dollars to the super rich. So when we look at this era, we must look at it with eyes wide open, and nothing can help you more than reading Fanon, because, he was allergic to bullshit. He spoke truth to power, no matter what the cost. In the introduction to The Wretched of the Earth, Sartre said Fanon was fearless, right? But he also said Fanon is not writing The Wretched of the Earth for Frenchmen to study. He could give less than a damn about us. He's writing to his brothers. He's writing to his people who are the oppressed in Algeria and throughout Africa. And he was, and he did. This is a new moment, but when we study Fanon, we're right in the middle of that moment, that revolutionary moment in the middle of the 60s, in the beginning of the 60s. The Algerian Revolution, the African revolutions that will follow and that preceded, the Latin American revolutions, all those kinds of things. But this is a moment where the world is at stake. And if we don't take it seriously, it will be gone in the blink of an eye.
I'm sure you see it, but there's an obvious contradiction that needs to be resolved here. And like the way that I think about it is capitalism and the ruling class, they require us to endlessly consume to sustain the system. But if their current obsession is to force AI and autonomous agents on us to take our jobs, how are we going to make money to continue to buy their products and, again, sustain the system? I see things like they're promising universal basic income as the solution here, or as the actual end goal, and we'll all be free to create art and live beautiful lives in harmony. But that can't be right when at every step of the way, they're actively trying to kill us off. So I guess my question is, what is the actual utility of AI, and like who is it serving? And what is the actual end goal here? Like, what is the real goal of the ruling class by pursuing this?
I actually think that that's an unsettled question, because this thing is happening so quickly that there are some people who are think about this. Why is the madness happening in Minneapolis happening? This malevolent quasi-paramilitary force going around treating people like, as my mother used to say, sugar, honey, iced tea. Why is that happening? It's happening to intimidate not just the protesters, but the American people, and to normalize the militarization of cops everywhere you look. Because you cannot look at what they're doing without seeing that they want to inculcate fear in the minds of millions of people. If you protest, this will happen to you. And if you listen to certain politicians, they've said as much. Now, I don't think highly of politicians. I rarely do, and I rarely have. They're tools of the super rich and the rich. And so, they're not like, the last thing they represent is the people. They represent capital in a capitalist country. However, they're saying it out loud right now. So, I don't think that this is a settled question. But are they able to do both things? Yes. And they have been doing both things if you look at how they treat Latino populations, black populations, so-called immigrant populations, right? And we live where? We live in a place of mass incarceration where millions of people are locked down for decades. And we've normalized that. Well, they want to normalize control and profit. And the fear that they're injecting into the population is one of their tools. AI is one of their tools. And they may, for a certain percentage of America, come up with what Selma talks about, an income for families. But billionaires are not built on giving money to the people. They're built on taking money from the people. They're looking at this from their perspective because it's their world. You literally have a guy who's the richest man in the history of humankind planning to settle a new planet as we speak and building the machines to take him and his tribe there. That's how far out this thing is. And I'm a science fiction nut, but I'm looking at this like, wow.
So I've heard someone describe it as Earth is a resort for 50 billionaires and the rest of us are just resort staff. I think there's truth to that. I think the ruling class, they know that Earth is a finite resource and capitalism requires endless production. And I think that their goal with this AI agenda is to one, thin the population and have the rest of us, I don't know, work the fields, work the physical things that can't be done with AI currently. Is the other goal to just harvest our organs so that they can continue to live on forever and ever?
Well, I think that, some people are going to think along those lines, and what's to stop them? And other people are going to think about, becoming transhumans, by using AI to try to inculcate human consciousness. And like, we're living in a moment of profound technological transformation, but we're living in a moment where every dream of the super rich is becoming true before their eyes. Super rich, the trillionaires, the ownership of the state is almost completed. Think about what they did when the Trumpites first came in. They took a wrecking ball to the federal workforce. Why was that possible? Why was that necessary? Because of all of the organized workers in America, except with the possible exception of the Teamsters, right? The federal workforce was the best educated, the best paid, the most talented workforce in the country. And they had like the best bennies. They destroyed it in a matter of months. And essentially said, F the rules, you got to break things. And they went around breaking things. And the pretext they used was about saving money. I know you've heard about when this ice storm, the natural ice, not the organization ice, came through America, affecting 70% of the population, froze cities, and created havoc. They told people at FEMA, well, we were planning to fire you, but we changed our minds. We'll keep you on for a few weeks. These are the same people that wrecked FEMA. So we're not talking about like long-term thinkers. We're talking about a class that serves the super rich and hopes to get a piece of the pie when they're done wrecking stuff. But they're not done wrecking stuff. They have to destroy the illusion of the Constitution. And they're doing it like right in front of your face. They're not hiding it. What Trump said the other day about nationalizing elections? You think this guy honestly has read the Constitution? I doubt it very seriously. Because here's a man who hates, above all, to be seen as stupid. But he's dumb as 2 blocks of concrete. I don't think he's read the Constitution. But if he has, and he says what he says, then these are the planned outcomes. They want to destroy everything that gets in the way of profit. Marx said, capitalism breaks down all Chinese walls. The Constitution is a Chinese wall. They don't care about that. They proved it. Killed that woman, and then, you remember what the cop said at the end? He said, you fucking cunt. That's what he said.
I don't know if you saw it, but in the footage of Alex Preddy being killed by ICE in Minneapolis, one of the agents starts applauding pretty aggressively. And my read on it was, this is very clearly a targeted killing. Like, if you're applauding like that after someone has been shot and killed, it's almost like you were hoping for that outcome. And I think the day before, or a couple days before he was killed, there's footage of Alex kicking an ICE vehicle and ICE getting out and roughing him up. So my read on the situation is they are creating profiles and targeting people who are just simply documenting and observing ICE. And I think that that's a reality that we need to grapple with.
How could they not? This is a bigger plan than we think. Congress is so freaking useless that they're on the wrong planet right now, because they're not speaking to this moment. Oh yeah, we want you to take your mask off and get ID and get retrained, and they're trying to make Nazism nicer. Wear better uniforms and instead of boots, shoes.
And they're being given budgets that eclipse the size of entire military budgets for small countries.
Because they are Trump's army. Never doubt that.
Philly's sheriff recently went viral. She was on camera and she said to ICE, don't come to Philly. You don't want this smoke. And everyone thought it was the most amazing thing ever. Like, oh my gosh, we're standing up to ICE. But it betrayed the reality, which is ICE is currently in Philly. And one of the places that they're operating in is the courthouse. And they're showing up undercover and they're abducting and disappearing people who are showing up for jury duty or preliminary hearings. And The sheriff and the Philadelphia Police Department aren't doing anything to stop it. And so the people in power that are supposed to be the resistance to this rising tide of fascism and who are talking all this talk, they're not actually doing anything. Their solutions are to be performative and say these things on camera for these sound bites. And if there's any sort of suggestion on their end, it's to give these agents more training or make them show their faces and give them body cameras. And at the end of the day, it's just another form of collaboration and not actually addressing the problem in a meaningful way.
This is beyond cameras. And, even when they put cameras on most of the cops of the country, it didn't stop shit. It didn't even slow them down. This moment demands a great deal more than what we have seen. And, I applaud Minnesotans because they have come out in the coldest weather in memory. And this is like one of the coldest places in the country. And they've come out and they have been human. They've cared about their neighbors. They've cared about the Somali community and, all those things. And they're to be commended. But the state, never. They have been too little, too late, and too slow. They're worrying about press releases. It doesn't fit this moment.
I'm glad you mentioned this moment because I'd really like to ask you about the idea of culture production in the sense that I see so many musicians and actors and artists who are still producing art and being creative as if we're not living through multiple live stream genocides, as if the people in power who make the decisions about whether we live and die are not trafficking children, as if ICE is not disappearing immigrants and brown people in their own neighborhoods. They're continuing to live in this alternate reality where they can continue producing things and not address what is actually happening in the world. I think about Nina Simone, who said an artist has a duty to create art that is a reflection of the times. And if the art is not a reflection of the times or speaking of the current nature of things, I don't want to consume it. I don't want to produce it. I want nothing to do with it. So what is the role of culture? And is there a responsibility for culture producers to be active participants and challenge the structures that are driving these things?
Fanon talks about culture, and on national culture, I think is his chapter, and he condemns the colonized cultural artist or writer and says, if you're writing about yesterday, you have failed. You must write about this moment and dream of, in your cultural creations, dream of a post-colonial moment, an anti-colonial moment. Your work, your art, must be a weapon against colonialism. This is Fanon. He understood it all because he thought it through and he dared to, speak his mind to his fullest capacity. Think about this. He was born in a colony, was a colonized subject, risked his life for the empire, was shot twice, got 2 medals for valor, got his GI Bill, went to the tours for medical school in France, and then he went to Algiers as the chef de service at a psychological hospital. And then he saw how Arabs were treated, and his heart called him to stand with them. He resigns a few years later. His resignation letter is in several books, and it is a work of art. He said, I came here to help these people, not to treat them like essentially, not to police them. I came to help them. That was my duty to help them. That's why I became a psychiatrist. He said, if I cannot help them, I will not work here. And he resigned his post. He joined the NLF. This was that guy. He understood it all because he dared to understand it all. When the students when they actually kind of bleed and read him, they will be transformed by that experience. That I promise you.
You're doing your PhD on Fanon, right? How far along are you?
I'm about 3 or 4 chapters away from the final, version.
Are you focusing on one work or are you looking at Fanon holistically?
Holistically and how he became Fanon. Again, my theory will be in there that, the Black Skin, White Mask was written by another man than the guy who wrote The Wretched of the Earth, because he continues to grow and continues to develop. He never said, I'm there, because he was on the move. He was on the move.
Fanon died at 36 and left behind this brief but incredibly deep body of work. It makes you wonder, if he had lived longer, what other ideas would he have come up with to help us move forward and better understand the situation of things. But I guess that's the tragic reality. We are constantly having to take the lessons that have been taught to us and left behind, and it's on us. And as he said, every generation has a mission, and they must discover it and fulfill it or betray it. So I think that it's on us to take the ideas that he and others like him have left us and push them forward.
I'm just glad he wrote some stuff down so that we could read it all these years later and live through his growth from a colonized subject to an anti-colonial warrior. I think that when he made that break in Algiers, he became something that he never was before. And I think that was a free man.